Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. This is a podcast about 10 years of ethnographic research on autistic Christians and ex-Christians, where I try to explain the intersection between autism and Christianity. In this episode, though, we aren't going to be doing that. In this episode, I have Dr. Punit Shah with me. He co-authored a paper on the double empathy problem that I think was really good and really useful, and something that I think is really important. I've already done an episode on my specific issues with the double empathy problem and how I think about that and how I think about that problem conceptually and how it is useful and there are use cases for it, and it often describes things that are useful for explaining dynamics of autistic social interaction, but that I found there were a lot of critiques of the double empathy problem when I really started to look at it. All my critiques, though, are coming from the perspective of sociology of religion. I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a cognitive scientist, I'm not a psychologist. This isn't my wheelhouse. And I've mentioned the double empathy problem in a few episodes, especially the one where we talked about mentalizing deficits and whether that's a thing. I didn't really dive into that. I mostly just said some people think autistic people have empathizing deficits or mentalizing deficits. But there's pushback with this concept of the double empathy problem. And I haven't really dived into it because this is not my field of specialty. I'm not a cognitive scientist. I'm not a neuroscientist or someone who specializes in the neuroscience of autism. All I do is just read a lot of those papers. However, with me on the podcast, we have someone who actually does those things. And he co-authored a paper called The Double Empathy Problem, a derivative chain analysis and cautionary note, where he's talked about a lot of the issues with the double empathy problem from a cognitive sciences perspective. Dr. Shah, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Thank you, John, if I can call you John, for inviting me to speak on
Absolutely.
your,
Yeah.
your podcast. So I'm Dr. Punit Shah, Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Bath, and that's based in the UK. Broadly speaking, I'm interested in social cognition, so the sort of mental processes that underpin social interaction, with a particular interest in how these sorts of processes operate in autistic people, but also more generally in society. And that's what drew my attention to this concept and the research on double empathy and the so-called double empathy problem, because it's an increasingly, as you've covered probably in your previous podcast, a concept, a term, research that's growing in popularity, which, as we can get onto, has some merit maybe, but also requires some critical attention.
Yeah. So maybe the best place to start is asking you a sort of loaded question that you discuss in this paper, which is, what is the double empathy problem? Like, what is it actually?
My response to that could be, what is the double empathy problem? What is it actually? In all honesty, I think that's the challenge. That's the challenge we face, because I'm not sure. Reading the research, I don't really know what it is, and that's the problem we face. It's an interesting. What I think it is it's something that is popular. It's a concept that people are interested in. It maybe captures some truisms, some, as you say, something about the social dynamics involving autistic people. But beyond that, and even what I've said maybe goes too far to actually say what it is, because I don't think that concept of double empathy has ever been formally defined, at least not by what we would expect in the psychology and cognitive sciences, but also reading more widely, hasn't been defined accurately or concretely, maybe even more broadly in the social sciences. So I don't think we know what it is really as a construct from an academic perspective. What it is in terms of what it means for the world is an idea, a concept, something that is garnering a lot of interest and something that warrants our attention.
Yeah, so this is a point I bring up a lot when I'm talking about the double empathy problem, is that it changes depending on who you're talking to in a way that is really difficult and frustrating to deal with. So in the episode where I talk about the double empathy problem, I tried to make it clear that people use the double empathy problem to talk about the specific cognitive trait of empathy, but also they aren't clear what type of empathy they're talking about, and that there are things like effective empathy and affective empathy. Are they talking about a deficit or a lack of deficit in both of those categories? Or are they talking about communication? Because when you look at the double empathy problem as it's explained in autism advocacy, a lot of the explanations around the double empathy problem have to do with communication barriers and communication deficits.
Mhm.
And empathy and communication, in that sense, are tied together. But
Mhm.
which is it? Is it a communication deficit, or is it a specific cognitive trait? And if it is a specific cognitive trait, how are we actually measuring this? Because a lot of the ways that it's measured in studies aren't really talking about empathy, right? So I discussed a few papers on like diffusion chain analysis, where they have people basically tell a story to each other and
Yeah.
ask, it, okay, did you test empathy there? I mean, did you even test communication? Is another question that I ask. Like, is that really communication, or are you sort of playing a game of telephone? Like parroting, sure, parroting information you heard from another person. Strictly speaking, that is a form of communication, but is that like how most autistic people engage in communication in their day to day? Did you actually test communication, or did you test like an autistic or homogeneous autistic diffusion chain versus a heterogeneous autism diffusion chain? Did you actually test communication, or did you just test our ability to repeat stories back to each other? And there are all these sorts of problems where it's like, I read your paper and it felt like a breath of fresh air, because I was like, finally, someone else who's in the sciences asking, okay, guys, what actually is this?
Yeah. Yeah. Your sort of intuition and your critical thinking around it is spot on, really, and it covers a lot of the things that we go through in the paper. What the approach that we took in order to tackle this challenge is what we call this sort of derivation chain analysis. So that looks at a critical analysis of this idea of double empathy from the conceptual level, the measurement problems that you're talking about, and then also the sort of statistics that become associated with it. So, as you've sort of already said, but just to reiterate that this concept, conceptualization in the psychology and cognitive sciences, but more broadly sociology and social sciences is incredibly important. The words you use to define something are incredibly important. The definition of these sorts of things is incredibly important. And one of the things that sometimes happens in psychology, more broadly in the social sciences, is this sort of jingle jangle fallacy, as it's sometimes known. And that's where things like, terms like communication, empathy start being used interchangeably when they shouldn't be. As you've said, most people appreciate that these things are different things. A lay member of the public, if you said to them, what's the difference between empathy and communication, most people, by virtue of the fact that these are different terms, understand that they're different things. And then when you start talking to people about it, most people have this intuition that they're separate things. And what seems to have happened with this issue of the double empathy problem is that it was all originally quite loosely conceptualized, very, very loosely conceptualized as a sort of some sort of social communication dynamic involving autistic and non-autistic people. And that's kind of escalated where different people have started using it, as you say, to mean what they want it to mean for their particular research question. For me, as a cognitive scientist, someone who was trained on in thinking about empathy needs to have a fairly concrete definition. It's difficult to define empathy because it's a messy psychological fuzzy construct, but we need to have some definition of empathy. And actually, never in the sort of history or the legacy of double empathy research has anyone sort of particularly pinned down, is it cognitive empathy? Is it affective empathy? What sort of empathy are we really measuring? And as you say, sometimes people have talked about double empathy where actually they've measured communication or ostensibly measured communication, which, as you say, is in and of itself a challenging thing to do.
Yeah, and one of the things I point out is Milton in his paper, The Double Empathy Problem, 10 years later, it explicitly says, Whistle, the theorizing behind the concept of the double empathy problem was initially derived through a combination of personal experience and anecdotal accounts, and limited qualitative data. The area of concern has since been approached by numerous research projects, particularly within the field of psychology. And I think that is a really important thing for people to understand. I mean, I sort of jokingly condensed that into being it was like vibes based analysis when it first came out, right? Like the theorizing of it was anecdotes and personal experience, which are great, right? But these aren't empirical measures, and that's not how you establish like a phenomenon in cognitive sciences, right? And
Yeah, as you
yeah,
say, like individual experiences, anecdote, small scale research is often it's so important. It's so exciting where you discover these sorts of truths, if you like, just from that everyday interaction. And a lot of us as psychologists often have some of our best ideas from you've observed something going on and you think someone's interacting and you develop an idea from that. And that I think is the strength of the double empathy problem, in that there was someone, and Milton in his original study at least started talking about it. And I think that's to Milton's credit, and it's good, broadly speaking, that someone wrote about it in some form. But when I read that 10 years later paper, or when I saw the title, I thought, well, here, I was only loosely aware of the double empathy of the original paper. And I thought, great, 10 years later, maybe it's been formalized into what we would expect as a formal theory in psychology or a sociological theory. But actually, it was more of a commentary on the development of the original concept and how other people have taken and expanded the concept and studied it in their own particular way. So I think actually we have a lot more work to do, as we cover in our paper, in developing and formalizing the theory and the concept in order to, even before we go ahead with measuring it and testing it in any meaningful way, which is exciting because I think there's something there, as you say, but there's a lot of work to do also in this area.
yeah, and I think this leads into the next point in your paper. So the first one is basically talking about how this is a fuzzy theoretical concept, but the next point is about the measuring challenges with the
Mhm.
double empathy problem. Like, how do you actually measure it? And this sort of builds off of the fuzzy theoretical concept, right? Because when you're trying to measure things, you need to know what it is you're actually trying to measure, right?
Yeah, yeah, and then there's so this idea of a derivation chain analysis has been around for a while, and there's an argument that if you have a weak concept, we shouldn't even be talking about measurement. We shouldn't be talking about statistical predictions. Like, you give up until you improve your theory. But what we try to do in the paper is actually, let's just accept for the moment, let's park this criticism and the challenges we have with the concept. But how has it been measured, and how can we start thinking about measuring it? So the ways in which some people have gone about trying to measure it, one of the approaches people have taken is looking at lived experience, taking qualitative reports of how people experience social interaction and how that might be linked to the double empathy problem. Again, as I've said, this is incredibly important. Often that rich qualitative data that we get, even discussions I'm having with you, these sorts of discussions and qualitative data are often the starting point for what might end up being some of the best quantitative, harder science work that we've seen. And that's through the social sciences and even the sort of natural sciences. Often these experiences that people have of, whether it's a physicist looking at the trajectories of light in studying, studying space, light, and time, through to psychology, these this qualitative experiential work, and that those data are incredibly important. But what we argue in the paper is that is important but not sufficient. That's exciting. We should do that, and we should do that work, I think, to a higher standard. I'm not sure the qualitative research on double empathy has been done to an especially high standard, partly because the concept of double empathy was fuzzy, but also the scale of the work has been relatively small in its scale. It perhaps hasn't captured the diversity of the autistic experience. It's maybe people that have self-selected into studies that have experienced social interaction difficulties, maybe not interviewed or take drawn on experience of autistic people who haven't experienced social difficulties with other autistic people, or maybe not experienced social difficulties with non-autistic people. Those experiences are incredibly important, not just from the perspective of understanding double empathy, but if we really, if the point of this work is to improve understanding of autism, is to improve the way in which we develop support mechanisms for autistic people, we also need to understand where social interaction is going right for autistic people with non-autistic people. And to understand that qualitatively is important. That research, I don't think, has been done, at least not to a standard that I would be expecting for something that's gained such popularity. Another issue is measuring empathy is notoriously difficult in the psychological and cognitive sciences. Defining empathy is difficult. Measuring it is really tough. And the tasks, the sort of experimental tasks that people have used, haven't, at least from my perspective, captured double empathy. So you talked about these diffusion chain type studies. Sometimes they're called serial chain tasks or Chinese whisper studies, where you're basically having to communicate short snippets of information across groups of people. Now, one of the things that we propose in our paper that the researchers could have done is look to see how people communicated, how people received and communicated emotional information. Because, empathy requires either an understanding or feeling of what other people are feeling. That's kind of a rough, again, fuzzy definition of empathy. But the sorts of stories, the vignettes, we call them in psychology, that were used as part of these studies didn't necessarily contain emotional information. So, for example, if they'd had emotional stories and non-emotional stories, again, this is a crude way to do it, but maybe you might have had a way to study the double empathy through communication of emotional information, again, imperfect, versus communication of non-emotional information. Maybe then you would have been closer to testing something like the double empathy problem. But that's never, surprisingly, really, to our surprise, it had never really been done. And more generally, when we reviewed the existing empirical experimental work on this, we found all sorts of problems. I don't know, you might not be familiar with it, but in the psychological sciences, we've gone through this recent period, and we're still there, through what we call this replication crisis in psychology. In short, a lot of psychological studies are problematic. They lack validity, they're not replicable, and psychology has gone through growing pains to try and tackle this through replication studies, through larger samples, through the use of certain statistical methods, through pre-registering your hypotheses before you collect the data. When we looked at the research on double empathy, we found a particularly glaring omissions or a lack of engagement in what we are now calling these sort of open science practices, with very few studies, if any, actually doing what we would call the gold standard, taking gold standard approaches in the psychological and cognitive sciences.
I think I found one that was pre-registered. I think that's about it. I don't know if you found more, but
No, there was that one study that was pre-registered. Again, actually, we didn't go into it in the paper, but even their pre-registration, the eventual paper, there were discrepancies between what they reported in the paper and what they'd pre-registered. Not ideal, not gold standard. And actually, the same group of authors have since gone on to try and replicate their original study and have failed to replicate that original study. So, to their credit, they've gone back and tried to retest the so-called double empathy problem in a larger sample through pre-registration in a more robust way. But in their most recent paper reported in Nature Human Behavior, they failed really to replicate their original findings. So actually, the very authors that had done what used to be lauded as the gold standard study in the double empathy area, when they've redone it, they haven't been able to replicate their findings. And that's an important thing that we all need to grapple with now.
yeah, and so I've been involved in a few attempts to validate the double empathy problem through basically mass gathering of autistic interactions online, and every single attempt that I've been through has come up with wildly inconclusive results, that has not been able to show really anything of any significance. And the thing that I found wasn't that autism plays a significant role, but the biggest thing that plays a significant role is background and education. And so what actually makes communication the most smooth is, do you have a shared background, and do you have a shared education? Do you work in the same field? Do you have those things? And that actually tends to be the thing that allows communication. And people having autism doesn't necessarily impact that. And oftentimes I joke on this podcast about competing autisms, where autistic people self-segregate into pockets and groups of other autistic people who are like them. And when those two groups meet, they rarely see eye to eye and
Mhm.
have enormous troubles communicating. And this is like I've documented this happening all the time. And so my own attempts to validate this is what initially made me quite skeptical of the double empathy problem, because I looked at it and I thought, okay, there are statistical predictions that I should be able to make if the double empathy problem is true, and that we should see bearing out in large scale mass communication. Like,
Mhm.
and I have enough of this to go through it and try to find patterns. And none of the patterns I was able to find had anything to do with autism. It all had to do with do these people both have PhDs in biology?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, yeah.
if yeah,
That's exactly sort of what I would predict. So when I started looking at this and then looking at the literature in social psychology and talking to some of my social psychologist colleagues, they said, "Well, I'm not sure why you autism researchers have gone off and done this. We've sort of known for forever that there are sort of other in group out group effects where things like gender, class, education level, shared interest. There are other things that dominate whether or not human social interaction
yeah,
is successful. And yeah, maybe autism, it could be one of those things, but you need to study that. You must study that in the context of all of these other social, economic, and contextual factors that we already know and we've known for decades are important. So, your findings very much line with the social psychological literature, which isn't to say there isn't something maybe autism specific, but I think that if one is to argue that there's something about autism or being neurodivergent or something else above and beyond those other factors that contributes to the success or the likelihood of poor success of social interactions. All of that needs to be statistically, conceptually measured, thought about, measured, and then statistically accounted for. And again, that research just hasn't been done yet,
yeah.
not convincingly.
And like another issue is just autism itself is a heterogeneous condition with a wide range of expressions. And so I'm not exactly sure why autism, being as heterogeneous as it is, you would expect like a fluidity of communication between us, just because. So like I all my free time I spend talking to autistic people to do this research. I have interviewed hundreds on hundreds of them. I have spoken to many of them, and some of them I have great, very fluid communication with, but some of them just none at all because we're very different from each other, and very different in ways that autism is clearly a factor. And so another thing is like, well, how homogeneous was your autistic population? Was it representative? Or so this isn't double empathy research, but a different part of autism research that I was looking at,
Yeah.
it basically for autism and religion, it recruited autistic people on college campuses.
Mhm.
And so it's like, yeah, like sure, this is representative of autistic people at university. You need to look at people outside of university, because university is often a place where there are a lot of changes of your ideas about how to think about religion, because you're just leaving your home and
Mhm.
now you're in this new environment and you're exploring new ideas. So like, uh, is this actually representative of autistic religious people as a whole, or did you sample bias your way into a conclusion? And I think probably there's a bunch of that also going on in these contexts as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, this is a broader problem we face, and I'm sure I confess, earlier on in my research, and I've tried to avoid it over the past decade, really. But we tend to, as psychologists, where we have limited funds, we tend to represent our students in our studies, whether
Yeah,
that's autistic students or non-autistic students. And there's a lot of research now showing that, of course, it's not a representative sample, and the sort of statistics we use to generalize to the wider population therefore aren't appropriate. So our probability values, p-values that we use in psychology don't actually mean anything if you're not sampling from an appropriate sample from the general population. And as you say, I think that's further compounded by the thing that you're studying as well. So like you say, in the context of the psychology of religion or religion, religion, religious practice and religiosity probably does change the function of whether you're a university student or not, and the transition over time. And the same thing happens with social interactions. Social interactions actually at the university level might be enhanced in some ways because you start sharing other commonalities with other people. I remember when I was at university, living in accommodation going out and drinking in the same places. All of these things can actually scaffold and act as a social lubricant or social glue in the way in which people might not realize. Like, is that something that's the same? Is that definitely the case? Definitely, are those same processes happening in autistic people or not? Some of these basic questions on social interaction haven't really been answered properly, let alone then complicating it further by thinking about bi-directional interaction between autistic and non-autistic people. So
Yeah.
one of the things that maybe just to summarize that point is a lot of our research on social interaction and social cognition in autism is problematic. And I include a lot of my own research on there where we just don't have enough good, high quality research on basic social interaction and social cognition in autism. And whilst that's lacking, it's going to be even more difficult to study things like double empathy in autistic people. The same way we need to improve the conceptualization of double empathy, we also need to do a lot of work improving the conceptualization and measurement of just social cognition in autism before we go on to tackling more complex interactions involving people of different neurotypes.
Yeah, and that's so one of the ways I've characterized a lot of this research is a frustrating lack of controls, and a frustrating lack of isolation of the things that you're actually trying to look at. And did you actually measure the thing that you think you measured, or did you measure something else? And that brings us to the next point in your paper, which is a unknown theory boundaries. And you brought this up, like who does this apply to and who does this not apply to is, I think, another really important thing. So autistic people and people with ADHD, is there a difference between those groups and just autistic groups, or autistic people and people with schizophrenia or something like that? Like, what about those? Do they have more or less fluid communication? Like, is it actually autism that's in the variable, or is it like social marginalization because of psychological disorder or something like that is another thing? So can you kind of just talk through those unknown theory boundary problems?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So this is a challenge we face of, let's say you come up with a theory in psychology or the cognitive sciences. Let's say you've got a good theory even, and then you've come up with a way to measure it, and you found like let's say let's assume we've got really good theory, we know exactly what the double empathy problem is, then we've got a good way to measure it. Let's assume that's there. But then the next step that we need to sort of take is, well, if we can measure it and we can measure it accurately, then we need to like really look at like the parameters for who it does and doesn't apply to. So you said something really important, interesting before. You said autism is really heterogeneous. So, we would maybe expect the theory to have certain boundaries, but actually, because a condition like autism is so heterogeneous, maybe we would expect that it might apply to certain autistic people or subgroups of people that are autistic and maybe not others. That might be a reasonable prediction to have, and maybe we could start thinking about testing that. We might want to test autism against other conditions or other constructs where there isn't so much heterogeneity. So then that might offer us some insights into like, is double empathy, if it is a thing and if we can measure it, then is it an autism specific thing, or is it something else is it something just to do with having a neurodevelopmental condition? Is it something that's linked to autism and having psychological difficulties or being socially ostracized that leads to this? It could be these other contextual factors, other overlapping phenomena that might be driving what we might currently be attributing to autism. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't matter for autistic people, because we know, for example, autism overlaps with ADHD, overlaps with constructs like alexithymia, so difficulties understanding and expressing emotion. These things are heightened in autism. So it might still be relevant and important for autistic people, but at the sort of level of psychological and sociological mechanisms even, we really need to start grappling with trying to understand what's autism specific and what's not autism specific. And if it's not an autism specific thing, we might, let's say, for example, come up with an intervention at the societal level that might have a disproportionate benefit for autistic people whilst also benefiting non-autistic people. And something like that might be required because, let's say, we want to improve everyone's social interaction, then that way it might make non-autistic people more socially skilled to interact with each other, but also autistic people, whilst also boosting autistic people's interaction with non-autistic people. Does that make sense? So if it's a general social thing, we need to understand that so that the changes maybe that we want to make to society to make us all happier and interacting more fruitfully happens at that level across society, irrespective of diagnosis or irrespective of neurotype.
Exactly. Yeah. So completely agree, and I think that makes total sense. Like it's important to just know what it is that we're dealing with, because if you want to build effective interventions, you sort of have to know what you're intervening in, and if you don't know what you're intervening in, like it's a pretty classic problem that causes a lot of issues. And so just defining these boundaries, I think, is something that is very important and not something that I've seen a lot of. And so I was very glad you brought it up. And then the final issue you brought up, which we've sort of already touched on, is weak statistical predictions made by the double empathy problem. So I've talked a bunch about my attempts on previous episodes to validate things like the double empathy problem through my research, and I simply just every prediction that I've seen people talk about the double empathy problem have made, I have not been able to validate. That doesn't mean that it's not a thing. I my methodology may have been off. I may have made research mistakes. I might not have been controlling for the things that I've been trying to control for, but the double empathy problem does make predictions. It makes predictions for how social interactions would play out, and it makes very specific predictions about other things that some people make very specific predictions about other things. It again, it's very difficult because, as you pointed out, this is a very fuzzy theoretical concept. So I personally just haven't found a level of empirical evidence that I'm happy with, and the types of predictions that I would expect it to make, I simply haven't been able to find that in any of the data that I've been looking at. But I was wondering if you could comment on that from your perspective.
Yeah, I think our review of the literature very much reflected that, where there were mixed and inconclusive findings all over the place. So the first thing to say is it is very difficult, arguably impossible, to make proper statistical predictions with a weak concept, with the measurement problems and unknown boundaries. What the sort of godfather, if you like, of the derivation chain analysis, Meehl, would say, actually, just go home. Don't start making predictions when everything else when you've got all these other problems. Just don't even go there. So that would be the hard line on why we should not make any statistical predictions at all. And I think some mathematical quantitative psychologists would take that hard line, and people are increasingly taking that hard line in the psychology and cognitive sciences, because we found in the discipline that where people are making statistical predictions on the basis of a loose theory or measurement issues, that you can never make that specific prediction. To sort of give you a concrete idea, where in the physics and natural sciences, often the sort of nature of predictions are, if we make let's say if we increase the width of a slot, a light slot, by 1 nanometer, this is going to lead to X percentage change, like a numerical prediction. That's the sort of level of prediction that you can make if you have a good theory and if you've got good ways of measuring light through like slits. You can make those sort of concrete numerical predictions. That would be the gold standard that we'd be hoping to do in psychology. It rarely happens. I struggle. I've never been able to do that in my own research, and that's certainly something that hasn't been attempted or hasn't been shown in relation to the double empathy problem. And even in the research that there is, and the sort of statistical predictions that have been made, there's no, the way in which the data goes, it's sort of, to put it, for want of a better way of putting it, it's all over the place. Some of the predictions that people have made is autistic people should have more successful interactions with autistic people than non-autistic people. Some studies find this. I would say now, actually, the majority of studies are now no longer really finding it. It also sometimes makes the prediction that neurotypical people or non-autistic people should struggle to understand, or autistic people or struggle to communicate with autistic people. Again, sometimes there's snippets of evidence of this, but nothing conclusive there. And actually, what I was struck by, again, this is not necessarily reflected in the paper, but recently we had what's called the sort of international autism conference in Seattle just a couple of months ago, where people were presenting some of the most up-to-date empirical research on double empathy. And almost all of the presenters in a whole session on the double empathy problem failed to find conclusive evidence for double empathy. Some people find little bits of evidence here or there, but really the overwhelming theme of that session at the conference was that there's no conclusive evidence for the double empathy problem. People didn't necessarily want to say it in that way, because people like the idea of it, but overwhelmingly with larger and larger studies, different ways of measuring empathy and double empathy, the converging line of evidence shows that there's no conclusive evidence for this phenomenon existing, at least in the way in which it's been put forward before.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I found as well. So I'm not too surprised by that. Yeah. So finally, you talk about conclusions and future directions, where you suggest improvements to the way that we think about double empathy problem to better reframe and restructure it. So can you just kind of go through what your suggestions are for improvements in future
Yeah,
directions? I think so. The first point is theoretical clarification,
yeah,
where you just suggest we we need to deal with this problem
yeah,
of ambiguity and
yeah,
overstretching, and
yeah. So
basically just draw hard boundaries.
yes,
Basically,
that's the starting point. Really has to be an overwhelming issue that we face, the existential issue that we face, is this sort of theoretical confusion. So before, I would say before we do any empirical work, any experimental work, any like using any fancy statistics, which we can come on to, and maybe people want to use that in time, we need to start with, let's try and make definitions. So should we call it the double empathy problem? Should empathy even be the term that's there as part of the concept? And one of the sort of concrete ways in which we suggest that people could go about it, and there are issues with this approach as well, but there are approaches where experts, as well as sort of lived experience experts, can get together and we can try and find some broad consensus on try and find agreement in the academic and non-academic community in trying to formalize what we think we want to measure here. And if it's not empathy, and if we're not going to measure empathy, and we don't care about empathy, and we want to measure social communication, then we need to try and come up with terminology and a theory that accurately conceptualizes what we want to go about measuring. And it sounds like a tall order, it sounds like a difficult thing to do, but if we don't do that, then everything else that's going to follow isn't going to work. We're still going to keep coming across these mixed findings, equivocal findings, failures to replicate, until we really pin down what we want to measure. And that's not to say that everyone's going to agree, that the world is going to agree on the terminology used, but we need to come to some rational consensus on what are the terms that we're going to use, what is the theory, and what are the predictions that we might make on the basis of that theory. So that theoretical clarification is the most important thing that researchers, academics need to do. And I think the autistic community and others have a really active role to play in this as well. I think at the moment, maybe you've alluded to this, I think people have accepted or gone with the zeitgeist and the excitement of the existence of the double empathy problem. I think as people have started realizing that it's not quite as robust as it's made out to be, I think autistic people, the autistic community, are now starting to say, actually, maybe it's not quite as clear cut as this. And there's an important role for autistic people to play in steering the discussions that researchers are having on this as well.
I would say, unfortunately, that hasn't been my experience. They mostly just get really mad at me for saying it doesn't quite empirically verify. They get mad at me and yell at me for invalidating their experiences. Anyway, so the another thing that I think you bring up in the paper, I can't remember if it's this section or another section, is that there is a whole host of literature about things that are very similar to the double empathy problem, and also just bring in that stuff as well, which it's like, yep, we should do that. And then you talk about improving measurements, which I think we've already talked about some already, which is just that we need better controls. We need better ways of isolating to see the thing that we measured is actually what we think it is. And then, yeah, from there, just better statistical approaches after we fix all those problems. But I think the biggest one is that sort of theoretical clarification has not happened. And once the theoretical clarification has happened, then the other problems are sort of downstream from that. And,
Yeah,
and
yeah, and
once we get that, yeah, we can
part of that
solve the
theoretical
rest.
clarification will come from that point. And I've probably neglected to mention this. I think one of the big issues that we found when reviewing the literature is that there are parallel literatures in social psychology on in-group, out-group social dynamics, which can feed into this. And there's also a rich literature in like the neurosciences and what has been termed the second person neuroscience, where there is already some sort of interesting work on like brain imaging, neuroimaging, scanning people's brains while they interact with each other. And there are some really like quite good theories and evolving theories in the second person neuroscience world for people in London and also in Germany. And actually, we found that these areas of work have been looked at like quite separately. And even though the research on, say, second person neuroscience predated the original paper on double empathy, because the neuroscience work has been ignored, there hasn't been this sort of integrative theoretical modeling. There hasn't been a synthesis, an appropriate synthesis across these different lines of theoretical work. And we hope to see more of this. And I think coming clean, I think one of the things that we could have done in our paper is attempt to do that. And maybe this is something that we are thinking about doing, but it's such a big undertaking because the literature is so messy now that it's quite a big task to undertake. Even our paper was quite a labor of love, really just trying to work our way through what's been done. Now that we made a start on that, one of the important next steps is now trying to bridge the gap between the literatures from the neurosciences and elsewhere in the social sciences and philosophy as well. And maybe even other things. I think over time, I've started to realize the importance of religion, philosophy, the philosophy of religion, and broader experiences and how all of these things might feed into social cognition and social interaction involving autistic people. So there's a lot there theoretically and philosophically to grapple with. A lot of exciting stuff to do, really. I don't think it should be seen as a negative thing. I think we should embrace it. But it will be challenging and there will be growing pains, so to speak, with doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a good summary of the actual content of the paper itself. How has this been received by the community or just whoever? Whoever? How's the feedback been?
It's a really, really good question. And the starting point for responding to that question was actually, we started writing this paper and we intended to submit it to a journal where we were invited to submit the paper. And normally in the sciences, when you're invited to submit a paper after like expressing an interest, that doesn't guarantee the paper will be published in the journal. But the editors are sort of saying, we like the idea, we will work with you to develop it, and there's a high chance that ultimately, with changes, it would be accepted in our journal. What actually happened is, after being invited to submit the paper to this journal, the editors for the special issue actually rejected the paper without sending it out to any other peer reviewers, because they said actually it's a little bit too harsh. It's maybe I'm paraphrasing what they said, it's a bit too controversial, maybe it's maybe a bit too harsh, and you're holding the double empathy research to a standard or a bar that maybe is unreasonable. And this was a surprise for us.
Absurd.
Yeah, this is a surprise for us in that, this is a really reputable journal, one of my favorite journals, so I'm not going to knock it in any way, and I won't talk about what journal it is. I don't think the editors would mind if I did. But that was a surprise for us because we thought we approached this in good faith and thinking, I think every theory should be held to a high standard. We thought we did a fair job in balancing the pros as well as the cons of the double empathy problem, and we thought it was quite a constructive paper. But that was an early sign, if you like, that what we felt was like genuinely a sort of unbiased, impartial view of the literature. But coming into this, we've not done any research on the double empathy problem. It's not as if we'd previously failed to find evidence for it and that we had any real skin in the game. Our interest was more as researchers of autism researchers. We think it's exciting, it's important, but we need a critical view of it. That was our take. So we were surprised there. And I'll be honest, actually, we were, as you always are with rejections, we were quite disappointed. And we thought, actually, we think there's something important here. What we're saying is important. And this is not something that you often do. And maybe some others do it in psychology, but normally when you're rejected from a journal, you tend to then send it to other journals that maybe might be easier to get into. And actually, we, for whatever reason, one could argue through divine intervention. I don't know what it was. And I know I've gone on to think maybe there was something of that God played some role in this, where impulsively, or guided by the Holy Spirit, maybe I would say, in all sincerity, we thought, well, let's submit it to one of the best journals in psychology, one of the very best journals. Why not? Let's go for it. Let's submit it to the very best journal, because then why not? And if we're holding the work up to a high standard, then we expect the editors at this very prestigious journal also to recognize the value of the work. So to give you context, maybe you've come across that idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The whole theory of Maslow's hierarchy of needs was published in Psychological Review, the journal that our paper eventually ended up at. We didn't think it would definitely get in. We thought the chances are very low. I've never published in the journal. I didn't think in my career I would publish in that journal. But we submitted it to the journal, and we got some very critical reviews, but we got some of the very best reviews I've ever had in my life. And I remember I was, I'm going on a tangent here, but I was at a barbecue one weekend. We got the decision letter from the editor saying, we want you to revise the paper. And one of the reviewers said, this is some of the very best science I've read, or it's science happening at its best. I don't think it was great science in that it wasn't empirical, but I think the reviewers got what we were doing. They appreciated the value of it. And, it underwent various revisions over time, and it took many months, and we really engaged with the reviewers. But we were really excited to get it into, for our own, selfishly for our own careers, it's good to have it in a prestigious journal. But also, I think this is one of the reasons that I'm speaking to you now. Often when psychological papers get into quote unquote good, successful journals, then people start finding out about it, and the impact of that work then starts to be realized. And this is what I think is starting to happen now. With that said, coming back to your question on how has it been received more widely, it's been mixed. I think a lot of our academic colleagues have come and said to us, actually, what you've done is really important. It's really brave of you in a way, because other people might not have touched this issue of the barge pole for fear of criticism. Others have said, or maybe this might have been too controversial. Isn't it going to, isn't it going to cause you problems? Maybe it will, but in the long run, I think we went into it with good intentions. I think we did a balanced job in reviewing the literature, and I think people that have actually read the paper in detail, and there are some people that have done that, have come, even if they disagree, have come to us to have a healthy discussion about it. And that's something that we're quite encouraged and inspired by.
Yeah, I thought it was a very fair paper. Obviously, it's critical of things that I am also critical of, so I'm prone to agree with that and think it and interpret it more charitably. But yeah, I asked about reception because my own experience talking about these things in autistic communities and to other autism researchers has not been, I'll say, the most well received. Maybe that's mostly because I have like a caustic personality or something, but generally speaking, it's good that you got it published though in such a prestigious journal, and I'm glad to see that other people are taking these quite seriously, because it's something that I care a lot about, and I think good autism research is very important, and I think this paper was a really useful analysis of the current literature as it exists. Yeah, do you have any other thoughts or anything else you wanted to share before we end this episode?
I think the only thought we sort of covered, I've talked about a lot of my own thoughts on this, but of course to say, the paper was authored by Lucy Livingston, first author, and Lutzer Hargitay, who's one of my PhD students, and it was actually a real team effort. I think the idea for the paper was originally mine, where I was like, let's write something about this. But if, I often have ideas and pipe dreams, and we wouldn't have got anywhere if it wasn't for Lucy starting to draft the paper. And a lot of the grunt work really of pouring through the different studies was done by Lutzer, the second author. So it was a real team effort on our part in coming up with this extensive paper. So I'm glad to be here and to discuss it with you. But all credit and more credit really to my co-authors. I think they nominated or prefer that I do a podcast, because I'm probably a bit more forthcoming with my views on this, and perhaps, let's say, I care a little less about what people might think about my views on the topic, which sometimes on the fly on a podcast like this, there's only so much you can censor yourself. There's only so much you can lie. Not that I think I've lied at all, but I think it's been good to have a discussion with you. And thank you for your encouragement and reading the paper. And please do share it with whoever you can.
Yeah, it's open access, so anyone can read it. I would encourage people to take a look at this, especially if they're interested in the double empathy problem and double empathy research. Anyway, that is all for now. If you would like to contact me, you can contact me, christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn. You can find me on Blue Sky at christianityon.bluesky.social. I think that's all for me. Do you want to sign off with anything or just end it here?
No, thank you for
Cool.
inviting me to talk, and best of luck with your own work on this
Yeah.
topic as well.
All right.
Let's maybe catch it 10 years on. Maybe we'll 10 years on. We'll see where we are with the problems with the double empathy problem. Maybe we'll
Yes.
chat in years.
Sounds good.